Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Thursday, the 11th of December, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and start off inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. I'll let you take it away.
Good morning, Mike. So yesterday, the FBI released a video, and they're warning that Chinese intelligence services are using deceptive job offers to target current and former U.S. government employees for espionage purposes. And according to this video, the FBI says that Chinese intelligence services are using professional social media and networking applications to target these government employees. And this is an espionage tactic that they've used to recruit extensively for economic espionage, and it now seems to be making its way to targeting government espionage. And a nonprofit called Mobile Pathways said that military lawyers that have been tapped to serve as immigration judges are issuing significantly more removal orders than other immigration judges. And they said over the last month, 78% of the orders issued by these military judges were for removal, compared to 63% from other immigration judges. And there are some media reports going around that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is canceling naturalization ceremonies for citizenship applicants from 19 countries that the Trump administration labeled as high risk. And there's a nonprofit called Project Citizenship that said some of its clients have had their naturalization ceremonies canceled through the beginning of next year, and they're expecting more cancellations. And I've seen multiple reports on both traditional media and social media in the last few days that this has been happening across the country. And the Trump administration did say they are going to expand that list to 30 countries, but I'm waiting on what the announcement of what those 30 countries, those additional 11 countries will be. And then on the domestic side, New Hampshire State Senator Dan Ennis, a Republican, co-sponsored a bill in New Hampshire with independent State Representative Aidan Ankerberg. And the bill, is going to start a mid-decade redistricting effort in New Hampshire. Right now, the New Hampshire government is a Republican trifecta. They have control of both chambers of their legislature and the governorship, but both of their House seats are Democrat held. And Ennis said that he's trying to revive a discussion about redistricting in the state in order to have at least one lean Republican district. And the Department of Homeland Security said it arrested two men from New Jersey yesterday who threatened to kill DHS official Tricia McLaughlin and ICE agents on social media. And they so far have been charged with two of the charges, at least, were conspiracy, terroristic threats, and cyber harassment. And then finally, Far Left Collective Crime Think announced yesterday that they're starting an ICE anti-recruiting campaign in coordination with two other far left groups. The groups created the poster seen here in addition to a video. And one of the parts of the announcement that stood out to me is that they said, once people see you with ICE, you're going to have to wear that mask every day for the rest of your life. So to me, this comes across as less of an attempt to persuade people not to join ICE, rather a threat for people who are thinking about joining ICE, that once they are able to identify these people, that they were going to be targeted with likely harassment campaigns.
Yeah, Robert, that's just another sign that our ongoing low-intensity conflict that drum's going to continue being beaten, obviously. Hey, I want to go into this Chinese targeting former federal workers with fake jobs thing real quick. This is something that we have seen from China as well, just a part of their recruitment strategy. Back during these previous government shutdowns, they've gone in where members of the military maybe or might not have been getting paid, federal workers were not getting paid. And, we've heard from federal officials saying that these Chinese intelligence officers were targeting federal employees and members of the military who were experiencing hardship during these periods of time when they were not being paid, and basically using that as leverage to try to recruit them for monetary gain. So this is something that is always going on in the background, and the Chinese will literally use just about any leverage they have to identify and recruit American sources on this. All right, thanks for that. Anything to add there, Robert?
Yeah, so there's this company called Shinobi Enterprises that they compiled a lot of data on Chinese espionage efforts. I think the owner of the company, he gave a presentation where he said he had something like 900 cases. And he said the majority of them seem to be monetarily motivated, and that this was this whole effort going on with the Chinese intelligence recruitment, that this is an extensive or a recruitment method that's used extensively for espionage or for economic espionage. And previously, when they were targeting military and government personnel that they were using, they were basically direct contacting them. And sometimes they would pretend to be a think tank, but quickly it became apparent that they were Chinese intelligence. But I would expect, I think that this they've been pretty successful with this recruitment method of part of it is a motivation that the Chinese, according to this, the Shinobi Enterprises, the Chinese government wants a more legitimate buildup of their own industry and their own military sectors, and so they're trying to attract people for longer term recruitment to work for the Chinese government. And so I think that this would be something that we see more of, targeting especially former government employees with the idea that they would move to China and work for universities or private enterprises in China rather than just to get access to classified information.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Robert. There's a question here from Ben. So the fake jobs are the payment, but what is the product? Well, I don't know what these fake jobs I don't know what they'd actually be doing. However, the product here would be a handful of things. It would be potentially sensitive information about your previous job, your work history, programs that you worked on, projects that you worked on. In addition to potentially sensitive information, it would probably be, there are these things called access agents. And so I imagine the Chinese would probably also be paying, at least some of them, for access to other people, to make introductions, for networking opportunities. And of course, this is for professional development or for professional networking. But if you're a Chinese intelligence officer, this is the spotting and assessing part of the source recruitment cycle. So you're spotting new potential sources and then assessing them for their placement and access and responsiveness, or the potential that you may be able to work with Chinese intelligence so that you could be motivated to do that. Great question, Ben. Anything to add there, Robert, before we move on?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that update. We'll move now to the global sit rep. All right. Let's start with this. His last name is Mast. Is it Brian Mast?
Yes.
All right. Interesting figure. I believe he served in the U.S. military. If I'm not mistaken, he also served with the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, I believe. We can Google it. We can figure it out, but I'm pretty sure he did. Yeah, he had this weird video where he showed up in his IDF uniform, like in his congressional office or something like that. I don't know, a little odd if you're an American. At any rate, he is the chairman of correct me if I'm wrong, he's now the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he was recently saying that India is basically at war with the United States, which is an interesting claim. Go ahead.
Yes. This is actually in context of the Ukraine war. He lists off Russia, China, expected, India, North Korea, and followed up saying are essentially at war with Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. He also added that the U.S. is attempting to deal with this financially in order to avoid it escalating to a kinetic war, his words. So, and I do want to say he actually did emphasize that India is on there. So he appears to think that India is actually at war with the United States here.
In the context of Ukraine.
Yes.
Okay. And not outside the context of Ukraine.
He did not add any context outside of Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. There's a lot of attention now on this oil tanker that was seized near Venezuela. And I saw a couple of SEALs on social media saying, those boys were ready. Just the meat eaters were chomping at the bit trying to get on this oil tanker to seize it. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, no SEALs got to do it. It was Coast Guard and Marines. So the United States seized an oil tanker near Venezuela yesterday, and they said this was a well-known ship that was shipping sanctioned oil between Venezuela and Iran to other customers. And Venezuela, obviously, announced this. They called this an act of international piracy. Now, when asked later, Trump actually said he expects the U.S. to keep the oil that is seized, and there is precedent for that as well. That happened as recently as 2020. Actually, a very similar operation as well. And then
we're just the United States is just going to end up keeping this oil tanker, or what's the deal?
Yep, all these assets are ours now.
Okay.
They will need judicial approval based on the 2020 seizure, but Now the oil in the tank are ours.
Okay, and the legal justification for this is illegal oil trade or sanctions or.
Yep.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep. They were shipping sanctioned oil, and the U.S. is not going to put up with it.
I see.
All right. Yesterday during a press conference, President Trump warned Colombian President Petro that he should wise up or he'll be next regarding Colombia's cocaine production. And the exact quote is long, but I've got it in the report if you want to read it. Basically warning, if once Maduro's done, you better stop producing cocaine or we're coming after you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Colombia has presidential elections coming up, I believe, in May of next year. So here pretty soon. Let's go back to something we reported on yesterday, which is that Honduran President Xiomara I think her name is also Castro, Xiomara Castro, basically accused the United States, accused President Trump of intervening or meddling in Honduran elections, basically telling members of the Honduran government or the populace that the United States could withhold foreign aid to Honduras if they did not elect the conservative National Party leader, Esfuri. And so I tied that back into this broader kind of fortress North America and hardening the rest of the Western Hemisphere, which is a theme that we have seen. We have seen the concept put forward, and we have seen some talk about it. And I would say this falls pretty firmly under action. So I do wonder at what point the United States is going to start leaning politically. Maybe I wouldn't necessarily say meddling, but trying to influence Colombian elections, because Petro has moved closer to China. He's a leftist. He's been talking about building this economic unity state with Venezuela, very Bolivarian revolutionary kind of talk. And that's a problem for Colombia and a problem for the United States as well, because Colombia, at least they were, a major non-NATO ally. And Colombia's president, Petro, has also talked about breaking relations with the U.S. military. And I believe we have stopped supporting their counter-narco operations in Colombia as well. So kind of a bad deal for both countries. So at any rate, they do have elections coming up in May. And I would not be surprised to see the Trump administration do something similar to Colombia that they did to Honduras. This is also part of this blue wave. We've seen a number of right-wing or center-right presidential candidates win. Javier Milei in Argentina, most notable. This Sunday, I believe it's this Sunday, Chile has elections, so on and so forth. And Juan Antonio Cast, who's a right-wing presidential candidate in Chile, is expected to take over for Gabriel Boric, who's the current president, who is a leftist. He's basically a communist. So we are seeing this slow but steady wave of right-wing presidents being elected in Latin America, which is very important. Tie it back into Fortress North America and more broadly hardening the Western Hemisphere. It's pretty much who you want leading those countries if you are trying to harden the Western Hemisphere against China. Anything to add there, Jared?
Yeah, I was rereading the national security strategy in the entire Western Hemisphere. It reads as if you're talking about the core of Fortress North America. So I think that is also another strong action. And with the release of that, and then Trump actually warning, and just quick part of the quote, he does end the warning with saying, I hope he's listening. He's going to be next. Between the release of the national security strategy saying, we will work with you, just get rid of the narco terrorists. We don't care what government you have. And warning, if we have to, we will get rid of you. Okay. Petro needs to actually go do this, because I would take this. If I was anybody in Latin America as a head of state, I would take that extremely seriously, if not existentially, for myself, because the United States, I do not think, is messing around in any capacity here.
All right. Great points. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on here to the United States and Japan.
Yes. So this was a change of activity. The United States and Japan conducted an escorted bomber flight this morning as a show of force against China and Russia's annual strategic bomber flight. We didn't cover that bomber flight because it is annual. They do it pretty much the same way every time they run up to the Arctic over the Sea of Japan. But I have not seen the allies actually counter this. And the Japanese Defense Ministry said that this confirmed the readiness posture of the self-defense forces, Japanese self-defense forces, and the U.S. forces, saying if you do this again, we will be ready. It's not scrambling jets. It's not, we better put out a strongly worded letter. No, we're going to get up in the air and we're going to follow you. We're going to be with you this whole time. And we're going to show that we can do this better. That's a stark change from what we have seen over the last few years.
All right. So China and Russia, they ran the strategic bomber flight basically as a message to Taiwan, to Japan, to the Philippines, to whomever in the area, in the region, that we can reach out and touch you. And now the United States and Japan are countering with one of their own.
Yes. And they have not done that in years. Mm-hmm. You might see them not directly related like this.
All right. Let's move on. China has their own GPS system, and so much of what China's been trying to do over the past 10 plus years, but definitely since 2022, is insulate themselves from Western economic pressure, from diplomatic, political, social pressure, et cetera. And one of those things that they've built their own independent systems for the military, so they're getting off U.S. dominated GPS, and they've also was it 22, where Chinese President Xi Jinping launched this global security initiative. Basically, China's trying to compete against all these Western-backed and U.S.-led international governance systems and really trying to promote their own. And basically what we're seeing is, just real briefly, this goes back to this concept of grand strategy. And this is something that Colonel John Boyd talked about. One of the many great gifts that he gave us is this concept of grand strategy. And he said grand strategy is connecting yourself to as many power centers as possible while simultaneously disconnecting your opponents from as many power centers as possible. And so in this context, China is pursuing their own grand strategy by trying to build up these international governance systems that they run, not the ones that are heavily influenced by the United States, which leads us to this global ocean governance system that they are trying to build, correct?
Yes. And this is part of the global governance initiative that they announced over the summer. Now, this is supposed to be for promoting common development of the oceans, so common fisheries, common deep sea mining, and upholding common maritime security. And I think both of those are important in their own right. One is China trying to gain access inside of territorial waters, because anybody who follows the Chinese fishing fleet, you see that they stop right outside where they legally can go, so that they can just pillage the oceans. And as far as upholding common maritime security, what that's talking about is setting a legal framework to be the recognized security guarantor of the global commons, the sea routes. That is the U.S. Navy's current job. That's what they're trying to replace it, so they have the authority to institute the global governance initiative.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to get too in the weeds on this, but China does not have a blue water navy. I guess this is anticipatory. Listen, well, they don't have a blue water navy in the ability to protect global sea lanes like the United States Navy currently does.
Yeah.
So how are they going to have this global governance if they don't have the means to enforce it?
Well,
or is this
number of hulls, I think it's anticipatory.
20 years from now,
I think it is
China maybe does have that. Jared, hang on just a second. Or is this something that they're building looking forward 20 years from now, where maybe they do have a blue water navy like that?
I do think it's that. The only thing that's really keeping them from having a true blue water navy is basically logistics. They need to have a series of ports that they know they can go to, like the U.S. Navy uses Rota, Spain, and Naples, Italy, and Manama, Bahrain, so that they have ports they know they can go to get food, to get fuel, to have a little bit of rest and refit, some maintenance. That's the thing that's really keeping China from being able to have a recognizable blue water navy. Technically, they do already. I think it's still on the edge and debatable, but officially they have one. And they have the number of hulls in order to actually be a guarantor. They just don't have the logistics to support it.
I see. But you had a couple of bases. You had a base off the coast of Africa. You maybe get one in the Azores or somewhere closer to the North Atlantic, and maybe a couple in South America. And then now you've got enabled logistics, correct?
Yep.
Okay. All right. On the Atlantic side, of Africa, by the way. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And we'll go ahead and move on. 46 protests today, roughly within the baseline. Just as a reminder, if you see a protest near you, you should go out and see who's out there. Just one brief note here on protests. We are obviously in a lull of the protest season. I expect this to start ramping back up March of next year. That's when the next No Kings 3.0 National Day of Action is scheduled for. And so I think we'll, in Afghanistan, it's like every spring, people talked about the Taliban spring offensive, and sometimes in some areas, yes, in some other areas, no. But it was always this annual thing. The media always talked about this Taliban spring offensive coming next year. And it's almost like we're getting into that here in protests and potentially riot season, but definitely direct action season as we move forward. By the way, just this quick note, Brian Mast did not serve in the IDF military. He served as a civilian. He didn't serve as a soldier in the IDF. He served as a civilian after retiring from the United States Army. But still, he showed up in an IDF uniform in that video back in whatever year that was. All right. Thanks for that, gents. Let's go ahead and move on. We do have a couple of items we're going to get into in greater detail. Let's go ahead and start with our Homeland Ops brief. Robert, go ahead.
So yesterday, it came out from the Washington Post that Department of Homeland Security has signed a $140 million contract with a company called Daedalus Aviation, and they're buying 6 Boeing 737 planes for deportation flight operations. This looks like DHS preparing to ramp up for an increase in deportation and detainee operations in 2026. I think this is also partly a security move, because there have been activists for the last year tracking these deportation flights, because DHS normally uses charter airlines to do this. And there have been a couple of protests earlier this year where they showed up to airports to protest some of these flights. And the airlines that are providing these charter flights have attempted to obscure the information on these deportation flights, but some of these activists have still been able to get a hold of which flights coming out of which airports are acting as deportation flights. The Trump administration...
Robert, briefly, on this point, we have seen protests against one particular airline company. It's called Avelo, and I believe they're based out of Houston, Texas. And they have been running deportation flights for ICE. When we talk about this burgeoning color revolution movement that we're seeing, everything they're trying to do, remember, this all goes back to reducing the legitimacy, authority, and capacity of the Trump agenda and what the federal government is trying to do right now. In terms of capacity, the reason why these activists and, in some cases, militants target airlines like Avelo, for instance, is to reduce the capacity. If they can have this public pressure campaign against these airline companies, and the airline companies cancel their contracts with ICE, all of a sudden ICE is not going to be able to deport potentially millions of people that they want to. And so that forces ICE either to go get another contract with another company, in which case that company will then be targeted for public pressure in these protest campaigns. So this is very interesting and very noteworthy that this is more or less going to insulate ICE from those kind of public pressure campaigns against these airliners in the coming years. So it's one thing that says ICE recognizes the risk, and they're taking steps to insulate themselves so that they can maintain the capacity to continue these deportation flights. At any rate, Robert, please continue.
They're also continuing protests in New Orleans. PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, said that they held a protest over the weekend where hundreds of people attended in New Orleans. There was also a protest outside of the Jefferson Parish, Louisiana Sheriff's Office yesterday to oppose Operation Cataloo Crunch. These activists are continuing to try to build their capacity for the resistance to this ICE and Customs and Border Protection surge. The idea that they have people show up to these protests and some proportion of them are able to be converted to direct action demonstrators or used to build up their local intelligence network, where they're sharing CBP and ICE sightings across New Orleans. The Trump administration also extended the federalization of Illinois National Guard troops an additional 32 days through the end of this year. which I think is part of this larger set of indicators that the Trump administration is planning to ramp up these operations next year. And I think it's likely we'll see more of these federalized National Guard troops receive extensions to their deployments. In Los Angeles, a federal district judge, or in San Francisco, a federal district judge blocked the Los Angeles and California National Guard deployment and ruled that the Trump administration has to return control of California National Guard troops back to Governor Gavin Newsom. The Trump administration said they're going to appeal, but I don't expect this to be blocked by the Ninth Circuit. They're still waiting on the Supreme Court ruling on Chicago troop deployments, and that could come by the end of this year, but we're running out of days, and it could be the beginning of next year before they release this ruling that they've been sitting on for roughly a month now. And then finally, yesterday, Democrats on the Senate Homeland Security Committee released a report on ICE and Customs and Border Protection operations, and they're alleging that these agencies are using excessive force and arbitrarily detaining U.S. citizens. In this report, they also said that it adds evidence that President Trump is building, quote, a nationwide paramilitary force. I read through the report, and ICE and CBP have already said, DHS has already said that they have detained citizens temporarily, so that's not news. But some of the stories in here that they've gathered from, I think it was 28 citizens that they say were detained between 4 and 48 hours, the vast majority of them for less than 12 hours, are, I think, embellished. Two of the examples they use are Miramar Martinez, which was a woman who was part of a rapid response group in Chicago that was shot by CBP agents, and George Reyes, who was guarding that illegal marijuana farm in California that was raided earlier this year. I think the point of this report is similar to what we've seen from calls from, for example, the mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, earlier this year for the Human Rights Council investigation into that federal surge. The idea is to generate these reports that are very heavily against the Trump administration that they can then distribute through media in an attempt to undermine legitimacy of the administration.
Robert, I imagine one of the problems that law enforcement and ICE encounters when they're trying to determine the identity of a U.S. citizen versus an illegal alien, I imagine, is that a lot of these activists are not identifying themselves, which probably lengthens their detainment. If they would just come out and say, this is who I am, here's my driver's license, here's my proof of citizenship, or at least in the part of determining who these people are, it seems to me like when that happens, they're released very quickly and sent on their way, as opposed to non-cooperation with ICE agents, which I imagine only prolongs their detainment.
Well, in some of these cases, most of these cases, even in this report, they basically admit that the ones that were detained, the vast majority of them were released pretty quickly. Some of them who refused to identify themselves were part of other criminal investigations, like the two examples, Martinez and Reyes, were the two of the handful that were held longer than a couple of hours. And I think that was much more likely to do with their involvement in criminal investigations, because in that case of the marijuana farm raid, that was a multi-agency criminal raid, and Martinez was accused of shooting at ICE agents. So that's not mentioned in the first part of the report, where they have cut down some of the stories and made them as sympathetic as possible. But they do include some of those details in a longer section of the report. And that seems to be the dividing line here, is when there is some alleged criminal activity, that's when you're seeing the longer holds as part of the criminal investigations. And for the most part, when somebody is able to prove that they're a citizen or a legal permanent resident, they're released pretty quickly.
All right. Thanks for that. Anything else to add?
No.
On the slide. All right. All right, let's move on here to the latest. This is, again, as the world turns, this thing going on between Illinois Governor Pritzker and Indiana. And one of the things, there have been a number of, first of all, let's take a step back. I was watching this podcast from David Frum yesterday, And he and this guy from, I think he's from Brookings Institution, were talking about how unfair it was that Texas had this mid-decade redistricting. And they went on and on about how this is not how democracy works, and they're going to disenfranchise Democrat voters in Texas and so on and so forth. And it was extremely, completely disingenuous, without also mentioning all the blue states that are gerrymandered against Republicans, where you have, in some of these states, you have Trump getting 40% of the vote and they have 0% of the House seats. So first of all, no one can pretend like this is just a Texas issue. This is a very long issue, specifically in blue states. And really, you have this scenario where Democrats have an outsized majority. Excuse me, not a majority. They have an outsized representation in the House expressly because so many of these blue states are gerrymandered. At any rate, Indiana is first they were, maybe now they will go on with a mid-decade redistricting plan, and Illinois is threatening to follow suit. Go ahead.
So yeah, J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, threatened to retaliate effectively by passing their own or pushing for their own gerrymandered map, a more gerrymandered than it already is. I think Illinois is 14 Democrat seats, 3 Republican seats. If Indiana does repass their map today, this Indiana State Senate is scheduled to vote on that map, where they're going to go pass a 9-0 Republican map, where right now they're at a 7-2 Republican to Democrat. I watched that episode, the David Frum show. They did bring up an interesting point that there's this concept called dummy mandering, and their argument was that Republicans might be running into a situation where they're dummy mandering, where they are making Republican held seats so weak that a wave election or a significant change in voter sentiment could actually flip what should be strong Republican seats over to the Democrats. I think that might be one of the reasons, because I've seen that used as a criticism of mid-decade redistricting, including from some Republicans and conservative commentators. That might be one of the reasons why there have been a lot of these states that have been hesitant to jump in. And though I do think that there is going to continue to be this tit for tat from states that are not concerned, where their Democrats or Republicans are not concerned about dummy mandering. And they also brought up something we've talked a lot about, is this Voting Rights Act Section 2. And I agree with them in their view that this is actually where Republicans will gain an advantage in mid-decade redistricting, is through the striking down of the requirement for majority minority districts. And I think this is that they do bring up that there's not really a base case for how this would play out. However, I do think that this is likely to favor Republicans, because the Voting Rights Act Section 2, it provides Democrats a tool that they can use to reach into red states to flip seats in their favor. And there's not really an equivalent action Republicans can take using the Voting Rights Act, because a lot of it's based on the majority minority district making. And Republicans don't really have a demographic advantage to reach in, a voter demographic advantage to reach into blue states and force them to make districts that favor Republicans. So they were a little bit they were more critical of this idea that it's going to be potentially more than 20 or more seats that are flipped, but I think it is likely to be at least in the mid-teens number of seats that could be flipped. Florida is waiting on that, and that's 5 already. And then there are across the Southeast, especially states like Alabama and Arkansas, that have 1 or 2 majority minority districts each, that we could see a major flip ahead of the 2026 election of 10 to 15 seats.
Mm-hmm. Robert, briefly, what are the chances that the Supreme Court comes out, they do strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which would give Republicans an extra, let's just call it a dozen seats, roughly 10 to 15, whatever it is. But the Supreme Court says this will not go into effect in the 26 midterms. It will wait to implement it in 28.
That's possible, because this idea of the concept of the Purcell principle, basically that the Supreme Court has said that courts should not release rulings that affect elections too close to the election. But I think right now the this case has been going on for a while. The most recent hearing was actually a rehearing. So they had oral arguments in the gerrymandering case, or the Voting Rights Act case, at the beginning of the year. And it's possible that they release it in January or even by the end of this month, with the idea that they will release it where it's not too close to the deadline for some of these states, like Florida's deadline to get into the primaries is in February or March, and some of these other states do have a longer timeline.
Wow. That's late. Texas was December. We just passed it last week.
Yeah, so Florida is waiting on. That's why DeSantis said that Florida is waiting on this decision, because they still have time. There's still time here to get people registered for the new districts. So some of the states have the deadline for actually getting into the election. It could vary by state, and some of them do have later timelines.
And hey, just Andy brings up an important point here, is voter turnout. Did you see this Miami election where you have a Democrat being elected mayor for the first time in 30 years or something like that? And you go back and you look at voter turnout, and I don't know what the final number was, but last time I looked at it, I think it was like 7%. Does that track?
Yeah, I did see that election. There's one thing that I think played a role here is that the Miami mayoral election is officially nonpartisan. So I don't think they actually put their party on the ballot. So that might have had an impact. But yeah, turnout, the low propensity voter issue has been known for a while. And for Republicans, that Trump is able to turn out a lot of these low propensity voters. And when his name's not on the ballot, there's a major decline in voter turnout. I think that is one of the issues that the Republican Party is facing next year in the midterm, is that Trump's name is not on the ballot. So there is a risk that these low propensity voters don't turn out. And that is one of the vulnerabilities that the Republican Party is going to have to figure out after 2028, or heading into 2028, is if Trump's name is not on the ballot, and how are they going to get these people turned out?
Sure, of course. All right. Thanks for that. And we do have some questions here today. A question here is, any idea, Robert, which of the 12 additional countries the Trump administration is considering restricting immigration or naturalization of?
No, I'm not sure. And they just said that they would release it soon. I think we first talked about it 2 weeks ago. So just waiting on whenever that order is going to happen.
All right. If India and China are at war with the United States, again, this Mast said this in the context of Ukraine. What does that mean for the manufacture of pharmaceuticals? We're going to skip this question because I actually don't think there's a big impact here. India is going to continue manufacturing pharmaceuticals for the United States. How effective or ineffective do you think the recent round of sanctions on Russia have been in hurting or putting pressure on their country and their war effort? Seems to me lower oil prices do more than sanctions. Yeah, anytime you have a country that's dependent, or at least partially dependent on oil sales, anything you do to restrict their oil exports, oil sales abroad, or low oil prices is going to harm them. Jared or Robert, do you have a really good answer here? Because it's kind of old, and it's kind of, this is something that people were talking back in 22, 23, 24, heading into almost 2026. Seems like this has been pretty played out. Very briefly, do either of you have an answer?
Yeah, no. I will never forget that the first time that the Russians came back to the negotiating table, the very first thing they asked for was re-access to SWIFT. That to me says that the sanctions are probably more effective than the let-on.
All right. Can AI data centers be submerged and cooled in the ocean? I don't know, Robert, what say you?
I guess potentially. If obviously salt water, they use fresh water because salt water is more corrosive to whatever cooling equipment. But I don't see why they couldn't. I just think it's a matter of they're getting tax breaks in certain areas. That's why they're going to some of these places like Virginia and Texas.
Yeah, it seems to me like it would not be a cost-effective. Considering the logistics, you've got to get people into these facilities, or you're going to build a tunnel into this thing? Like, I don't know. And then you've got to have a body of water that has an ambient temperature strong enough to resist the heat from the AI data center. I don't know. It seems
Yeah, the construction is just going to be more expensive. You have pressure from water, like pressure from being submerged in water that you don't have from being built on normal land, and then just the corrosive effect of being in moving water. The materials and everything become significantly more expensive.
Right, I agree that the U.S. is in decline, and I think it's irreversible. However, by all metrics, the Chinese economy is anything but stable. Okay. I guess that's not a question. How does one take down the Chinese GPS without creating massive space wreckage? Well, I mean, Jared, I think you've covered this before. What is it, Baidu, or who runs the Chinese GPS now, or something like that?
Baidu.
All right. Just briefly, there have been accusations that the United States was trying to affect the timing of their GPS, which would throw everything in a disarray. So I guess that's one way. You don't have to necessarily take out the satellites. You launch a cyber electronic warfare attack, correct?
Yep. That would be a great way to do it. And the Chinese famously they built a satellite that would grab things to move a satellite, but could also throw it. No reason the U.S. couldn't do the same thing.
That's some James Bond Spectre stuff. All right, where's the Chinese submarine program at? Well, Jared, we know they're turning out these fast attack submarines in much larger quantities. What is their quality, though?
Last I heard from a submariner was that they actually were advancing quite significantly. The rule of thumb for when I was in was that they were pretty far behind, but it sounds like they've been catching up.
All right. If financialization and the global dollar means hollowing out American manufacturing, is it possible to successfully reshore manufacturing? What does this mean for the dollar in the U.S. consumer? That's a much better question for guys like Michael Every. But in general, this goes back to the Triffin dilemma that we talked about yesterday. And we've been talking about this for a long time. Basically, anytime you have a country, or I guess this is theoretical because this is the first time that we've had a global financial system, which is based on the dollar, obviously. Anytime you have a country that produces a currency as the basis for the global financial system, the United States has to export dollars, which means we have to buy things. We have to import products into our country, and we have to export dollars abroad. Otherwise, you don't have a global dollar system. If there aren't enough dollars in circulation abroad, you don't have a global dollar system. That means that we have to be net buyers. We cannot be net producers and sellers. If we were net sellers, we would be bringing in dollars from abroad and exporting products out. And you cannot do that. That's the Triffin dilemma. The Triffin dilemma actually states that this can work for a while. Eventually, it will end. And when Michael Every says the dollar system is going to end, it was always going to end. This is exactly why, because this is simply not sustainable on this kind of timeline. And I think we are obviously nearing the end of this dollar system, at least as we've known it. So in terms of hollowing out American manufacturing, is it possible to successfully reshore manufacturing? Not all manufacturing. Who was this idiot that said, yeah, he wants American, I forgot whatever he said. It was something stupid, like he wants us making little trinkets or something here in the United States. We got to bring back critical manufacturing. We have to bring back the stuff that our economy needs, and predominantly, that should be tech. And Robert, anything else to add there on critical manufacturing? The other part of reshoring critical manufacturing is it's not just the building of factories and manufacturing facilities, and it's not just the energy problem. We do not have enough electricity generation to run these new plants. It is also raw materials, getting this stuff from abroad. One thing that Michael Every has pointed out is that China is trying to corner the market. They're trying to control supply chains. And if China does control these supply chains, it kind of doesn't matter what factories we can build here. If we cannot get the raw materials and the component parts that we need into this country, or at least into the Western Hemisphere to build what we need, the manufacturing kind of doesn't matter if we don't have the supply chains to build it. Anything to add there, Robert?
Well, on the defense side, there are some lower tech manufacturing that's probably a good idea to have, things like microwaves and things that basically where you can take a factory that's making something, consumer good, that can be turned into a drone factory, for example. Especially if you're talking specifically about the defense industry side, because that's how we ramped up prior to World War II and into the war to have this massive war economy, was taking already existing manufacturing lines that could be easily changed into war manufacturing. And in 2025, that means probably FPV drones at mass scale. So that's another industry that where it would be advantageous for the U.S. to bring back to the United States is some appliances, especially advanced appliances, that could be turned into drone factories. Things like textiles, probably not as key as they were back then, but I think the Trump administration, their focus that I've seen so far has been on rare earth minerals, though they have been announcing more public money, public capital going into some of these ventures. I haven't seen yet any kind of talk about massive expansion of refining, and that, as you pointed out, is the key here. It's not necessarily the mining or the making of products with the rare earth minerals. The choke point is the refining. And if I remember correctly, China has something like almost 90% of global refining capacity.
Correct. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Hey, Jared, why does China even need a navy? Or what, let me rephrase it. Why do they need a blue water navy? So they have to protect their sea lanes and their trade. Does China need a blue water navy for force projection yet? What kind of navy do they actually need?
They need one. You're not going out to any of the seas right next to them without having a significant blue water navy capacity, and that doesn't even begin to get into what rejuvenation means. They have to be the center of civilization for the earth just to achieve rejuvenation. So you have to be the guarantor of the global commons.
All right, Lori, I hope that answers your question. The next president is Democrat. I hope DHS sells those planes before Trump leaves. Otherwise, they will be used to fly the people they deported back in. Very astute observation. And yeah, certainly something to consider. By the way, let me just say this. I've said this before, and I think the United States probably did avert a violent domestic conflict, or at least a substantial worsening of low intensity conflict when voters elected Donald Trump as president as opposed to Kamala Harris, because we would have seen 10, 20, 30 plus million illegals likely receive amnesty and eventual citizenship. And, I've talked about this before, like even looking back to 2016, I think Trump in 2016, Trump won the state of Texas by 1 million votes. And in 2016, there were 1.5 million illegals in the state of Texas. So we're talking about flipping reliable red states blue with any kind of amnesty and pathway to citizenship on a long enough timeline. I'm not saying it would have happened overnight, and Congress obviously has to be involved, so there are substantial hurdles there. But otherwise, when I look at my friends group and I look at my political and social networks here in Central Texas, I don't think anyone, we just simply would not have allowed that to happen. We would have staunchly opposed it. I will say that. And we're talking about our futures and our livelihoods really coming under attack, giving so much substantial political power just artificially by an executive order or by an act of Congress. And all of a sudden we have this quasi-conservative state. Governor Abbott's worthless. But there are plenty of great Texas politicians here who do share our values. And we're talking about the erasure of political power here and the erasure of political representation, just artificially by creating millions and millions, 10, 20, 30 plus million new U.S. citizens who vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. That is I don't know if you'd call it a demographic coup, but it's certainly an electoral coup here. And it would just completely remove the power that we have in our state, our democratically elected power. And so if it stands to reason that we would have had a far worsening domestic conflict if that had happened in say in most recently, starting this year, if Kamala Harris had won, then it stands to reason that if Democrats pursue that course of action in the future, say starting in 2029, if we do see a blue wave where Democrats take the House, the Senate, and the White House, it stands to reason like that they would also pursue that in 2029, and we are going to be back into that situation again. So, let me just say this: I think this country is inevitably heading towards a worsening domestic conflict. I'm not exactly sure what that's going to look like. Depends on who gets elected and what policies and how they pursue those certain policies. But I will tell you, you should strongly consider that we will have a domestic conflict in the next 3 years. I know we've been talking about this. I've been talking about it. I've made that 5-video series called Breaking Down Civil War II. I made that back in, was that 2020 or 2019, I think even. And so 6-7 years ago. So I've been talking about this for a while and have not put a date on it. I just said, look, I think this is trending towards this. I think we're heading towards this. I don't know when it is. I don't know what it's going to look like, obviously, but I'll tell you, I'm feeling a much greater sense of urgency around what happens in 2029. You got 3 years, basically. You should be looking at this as you have no longer than 3 years before this happens. With that, guys, we're going to take Jared. Can you just grab like the best couple of questions that we have left, and we'll just answer the top couple of questions because we do have a handful here. We'll take this one on the Triffin dilemma. To counter the possibility of hyperinflation that would come from the end state of the Triffin dilemma, we have to reduce the export of dollars. Would this be a change to demand side economics? Well, okay, so in a best case scenario, and this is based off my conversation with Michael Every, a best case scenario is the dollar system does not go away completely. We just no longer have a global dollar-based system, and basically have the global south of the BRICS countries moving away potentially entirely from the dollar, or at least substantially from the dollar. And then you have dollars retreating back to the Western hemisphere. So this could be, like Argentina has talked about going on to the dollar system. There could be potentially in the Western hemisphere a number of countries that adopt the dollar system, and you have basically a hemispheric reserve currency in the dollar. You have a dollar-based financial system in the Western hemisphere, even though it does not exist at the global level anymore. We don't have the global dollar financial system. So listen, there's a lot of possibilities out there, but just in terms of hyperinflation, the way countries get hyperinflation is there's like 5 things that central banks cannot do, if they want to avoid hyperinflation. And I wrote this report back in 2021. At the time, the Federal Reserve was doing 3 of the 5 things that you cannot do. And there's a handful of them, like governments cannot sell assets just for temporary reprieve governments cannot sell assets for a temporary reprieve, because what happens is they sell off the assets, they get the money. And if they don't tackle their spending problem, then that money just goes out the door. And now all of a sudden you have a government with fewer assets. And so the currency comes under much greater stress. And there's like, other things like you can't print money to fund deficits, or, obviously you can do that to a degree. But by far the number one trigger for hyperinflation is actually war, because what happens is during a time of war, a destructive war, rather, if you get invaded, or maybe in this next conflict's case, you have destructive cyber attacks, and basically you break down the economy. And once you start breaking the economy, the government's tax revenues start to decrease. And what do central banks do all the time when that happens? They start printing money. And then you start getting into this problem of inflation. And then central banks have to print more money due to inflation. And so if a war is so destructive to a country's economy that people can no longer pay taxes, or they stop paying taxes, and then you have a central bank printing money, you basically just get into this doom loop, they call it. And it's very interesting because the during the Weimar hyperinflation, you actually have the Rudy Havenstein, who was the central banker at the time. He basically came out and said, we could have stopped hyperinflation at any time. We just had to stop printing money. If we had just stopped printing money, we would have avoided hyperinflation, but they didn't. And when he was asked why they kept printing money, he said, because the government needed it. And so I can see potentially the United States getting into that kind of scenario, but it's a ways out. And thanks for standing by while I rambled here. Jared, let's take one more question. Just grab the best question that we have. Actually, we'll do two more questions. I'm all for deportations and cracking down on H-1B abuses, but fear that unless we do this right, we'll throw the baby out with the bathwater and drive inflationary pressure due to the loss of lower wage workers. Well, I think the argument here is that when you reduce H-1Bs, you backfill them with American hires, and you're going to have to pay Americans higher wages than you do H-1Bs. So I do think there's that, what do they call it? The wage price spiral. Basically, when you start hiring Americans and you start paying them more money, they go out and they spend more money. And when you have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, you have price increases. And when prices increase, and now you have people who are who fall behind, and they start asking for pay increases to keep up with the rate of inflation and higher prices. And then they start making more money, so wages increase, and then they go out and spend that extra money, and then prices increase again, and that's what they call the wage price spiral. So yeah, potentially maybe there's something there. I'm not an economist, but I just generally, Ben, I hope that answers your question, and I think that's the argument from the administration. Last question here is, other than building your intelligence network and area study, how does a regular guy prepare? Well, listen, I don't talk about bug out bags and your 7 years of mountain house in your basement or anything like that. But look, basically there's three things you need to be doing on the intelligence side. Remember, everything starts with intelligence, because intelligence tells you where to go, when to go, how to get there, and who to do it to, whatever you're trying to do, whether you're trying to get a good sheriff elected, or you're trying to respond to flooding from a hurricane, doing search and rescue, or you're responding to man-made horrors beyond human comprehension, or whatever they say. And so everything has to start with intelligence. Anything that you try to do locally to prepare for this, you point out doing your area study. Everything starts with an area study. It doesn't matter if we have hyperinflation, nuclear war with Russia, or World War III with China, whatever is going to happen at the strategic level, you're going to be affected at the tactical level, out your front door, down your driveway, down your street, in and around your neighborhood and your community. So you have to identify the tactical level effects of those strategic level events. So again, it doesn't matter if we have an EMP or a destructive cyber attack or World War III with China. You have to figure out how that's going to affect you at the local level, because that's what you prepare for. The people who say, I'm preparing for EMP, or I'm preparing for hyperinflation, I'm preparing for World War III with China, they're not actually preparing for those things. They're preparing for the follow-on effects of those things at their local level. So if you don't identify those threats and hazards and vulnerabilities that you have at the local level, you're kind of play preparing. You're not actually preparing for the things that will directly affect you. That's what you prepare for. That's why you do an area study. The second thing is the intelligence network. As you say, we've got to have information. Internet up, internet down, grid up, grid down, doesn't matter. You need humans. In the Army, we said every soldier is a sensor. You need humans who see things and hear things and think things, and you have to connect these people to yourself. So, you have to look at your members of your neighborhood as sensors, and if you connect them via radio or ham radio or a signal chat group or a Facebook group or whatever, however you connect these people is on you. That's mission dependent on you. But you do have to connect them. The third thing is real-time intelligence collection. So we have to automate open source intelligence. I've got a whole chapter in this upcoming book that's going to be released, I think, on January the 6th. I'll let you know when I'm certain that it's going to be out by January 6th. I've got a whole chapter on automating open source intelligence. So we have to be able to take information from public sources, the internet, even local sources, your county commission meetings, your city hall meetings, that's all open source. That's publicly available information. So we've got to get it from where it sits in front of us, because we have to understand it. And so whether you do that through data mining, social media, or there's a bunch of different ways you can do that. You got to do that. You got to be able to receive do basic SIGINT, basic signals intelligence. You have to be able to turn on a radio and listen to people talking about whatever they're talking about, finding those conversations or finding that information that's being relayed through radio frequencies and being able to listen into that. You got to be able to do that. Imagery intelligence is another one, whether that's a drone or satellite imagery. You've got to have that kind of information feeding into your intel effort. And then human intelligence, which we kind of covered on the intelligence network. So those are the three things. That's kind of the broader area intelligence framework. Do your area study, build your intelligence network, and then build your real-time intelligence collection capabilities. Again, I'm not going to tell you how much food or water or whatever you need stored up. There's plenty of people who do that online. It's not me. I will tell you, if you want to drive operations, if you want to be prepared for local tactical level threats, if you want to plan for community security or run community security operations during a man-made or natural disaster, you simply have to front load intelligence. I've done a bunch of webinars and stuff on this and written a ton of stuff. First of all, if you don't follow me on X, go over there and follow me on X. It's at Grayzone Intel, and I will follow. I'll be posting a lot more about this. So I hope that answers your question, Trev. With that, everyone, the questions that are left in the chat we'll get to tomorrow. Everyone, thanks so much for watching. We appreciate your support. Best of luck to everyone. Listen, we're not going anywhere. Actually, at the end of this month, we have this big new rollout on the Forward Observer website, and we are building open source intelligence tools to help connect members to the information that they need to make better decisions about their future at the local level. So we're not talking about, we'll continue to talk about what's going on in Congress and what's going on with Venezuela and China and all the rest, the stuff that we talk about every day. But what we really want to do is connect you with a lot of information that you are not seeing. And we're going to do that through the new early warning intelligence and news platform. So everyone, appreciate your support. Have a great rest of your day. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.